So I would like to talk about the agricultural revolution as a precursor towards the industrial revolution. We're actually going to have a split in the middle when we talk about the Enlightenment, because there are certain ideas that happen in the Enlightenment that help propel us towards the industrial revolution in some ways. So we'll talk about the agricultural revolution, as these are the prerequisites for an industrial revolution. And of course, normal caveats apply. Almost this topic you can have an entire class on, no problem at all. You can also have an entire semester on. So this is, again, sort of a very potted and very selective talk about what is going on in the agricultural revolution and how it might pertain to the industrial revolution. So without further ado, we'll talk about the agricultural revolution. Now, of course, it is important to note that at this moment that this is the largest sector in the largest sector of the economy. So any changes that you make in an agricultural setting is going to lead to changes elsewhere. At least 1/3 of the population in England is employed in some sort of agricultural work. And I think that's probably true for the rest of the continent too. Until we have proper industrialization, everybody's working in the fields, or at least most people are working in the fields. 1/3 of your national income comes through agriculture. And it is critical to support any future progress. You need money to support future investments. You can't build things out of nothing, so you have to have money. And the way that you will gain this is either through landlord rents, or you'll get this through farmers' profits. And what we have in England is a fairly unique situation where we have the English landed classes are willing to invest in new ideas and new things and greater opportunities for investment. And this is kind of an important series of things that you kind of need to have for it to begin, or at least to start to begin. Now, in an agricultural revolution, there are some other requisites that you need to have. You need a labor force. You need to have a reasonable labor force. Industrialization needs a growth of a non-agricultural force. But as we said before, you've got at least 1/3 of the population in agriculture. And so this is going to be a problem. You've got to somehow get those people out. You need people to get out of the agricultural sector and to work in non-agricultural sectors. But of course, you've got to have a sector to be able to support this moving population. But of course, as you move people out of an area and into a new area, if they're not working in agriculture, then they do need to be working in something else. And you still have to support everybody, pardon the cat, you do have to support everybody to who are not working in the fields. If you've got people working in the fields, then they will be producing food for people who are working in the cities or in mines. Sorry about the cat here. He's very needy. So what we need to do, we have to have certain things, and they must be simultaneous. Otherwise, you can't feed people moving into the cities, and you can't produce enough people to move into those cities. Because, of course, part of the problems with agriculture is that, well, part of the problem at the time is that when people die early and die frequently, it is difficult to get, people can't live long enough to produce more people, and you can't gain enough momentum to keep that going because of failures in agriculture, the lack of food, for example, and various other things that we'll talk about when we talk about the Poor Laws in a way. There are certain things that need to happen to gain a critical mass for a population to increase. So we've got to have that happening. And so what we have is a cycle, if you like. First off, you have a growing population which increases the strain on agriculture. Then that drives a requirement, or a requirement for better agricultural production, which in turn that requires investment. And lastly, that leads to increasing agricultural productivity. So it sort of works within itself. And so food supplies are actually quite critical. You have a rapid rise of people in society who aren't actually growing their own food. And this is kind of important. Food production must remain constant with the extra numbers that you're producing. In other words, you end up with food well, you end up with food riots and political problems if your production of food cannot keep pace with your population. And of course, we talked a little bit about the French Revolution last time. Part of the French Revolution came about because of failed harvests, as in they could not keep up with feeding enough people. Of course, that's not necessarily a failure of production, that's a failure of keeping things, but it's also, there is no mitigating way to keep your harvests at a steady, decent rate. If something goes wrong, what do you do? And of course, better agricultural methods and ways of doing agriculture will help inure you against future problems. But of course, you've got to have those improvements, those betterments. So if food production is low, which is very often the case, the amount of money that you spend as a person is going to be quite high on a food bill. At the moment, we're all living in a sort of a worldwide recession, I guess, and everybody's bills are going up in many places, and many people's food bills are going up. So when you're spending most of your paycheck on a particular substance or a particular issue, a line item in your budget, what it means is that you don't have enough money to spend in other places. So if in this particular case, if you are spending all your money on food, then you're not buying things that are produced by industry. And so this causes industry to sort of not do so well. So British agriculture increased its output, I guess. There are a number of common arguments, and most of them stem from an English a series of lectures in 1884 by Arnold Toynbee called Lectures on the Industrial Revolution. And Toynbee put forward certain ideas that are very quite common and maybe aren't quite right. But he put several of the things that he put forward was, first off, that most of the agricultural revolution was down to what he called great men, which was the kind of way of writing history back then. People like Jethro Tull, who invented, I think it was the seed drill, Lord Townsend, Arthur Young. These are all people who came up with particular innovations and transformed English society, agriculture. And this all made agriculture into a kind of machine that could cater for all the people living in your cities. Toynbee also talked about land. Old land was cultivated better. This is one of his arguments, through innovations in farming to do with field rotation, or crop rotation, as some people call it. And so, for example, one of the arguments, kind of obscure argument, but kind of a fun argument, is that turnips helped start the Industrial Revolution. William Marshall in 1795 said that if there's no dung, then you don't have any turnips. And without turnips, you have no bullocks. There's no bullocks, you have no barley, no clover, no wheat, and nothing. And so we have this idea, and it's not a bad idea, that you sort of have a series, a crop rotation. You start out by growing something in the wintertime. In the summertime, you grow barley, and then maybe in the autumn or the wintertime, you let it lie fallow. In other words, you don't use it anymore, because we haven't got very good, I suppose, fertilizers. And you've got to have fertilizers to keep things going, because the soil gets depleted. And in fact, if any of you are interested, at the moment, our soil is so depleted that the amount of minerals that we get in our food nowadays is horrendously low. I remember reading at least 20 something years ago, articles pointing out that we'd lost something like 70 to 100% in many cases of some of the minerals and vitamins that we would normally get in our fruit and vegetables. And recently I read maybe a couple of years ago, another article pointing out that they'd gone even further. So we're not getting the stuff in our food, and this is the problem. One of the problems is that we are depleting the soil, and we've got nothing to replenish it with. But back then, this was not so much of an issue. We have the three-crop system. The Dutch had discovered the four-field system. The English started out with the three-field. Everybody else, I think, was doing the three-field. And the Dutch discovered a four-field system where they would grow fodder for your cattle, and you could feed your cattle, which meant that you could have more meat. Very often in older times, you'd have to slaughter most of your animals during the winter time, simply because you wouldn't be able to afford to feed them through the winter. But now you could have meat, and you could have fresh meat, not salted meat. And of course, salted meat, as I think various health organizations have pointed out, is quite bad for you. cured meat, smoked meat, all very, very terrible for you. But now you can eat fresh meat, not salted meat, so your health is better. And this whole system gives us better availability. Potatoes, that's another great crop that was produced, 7 times the value of grain per unit of land. So in other words, you get more nutritional value out of an acre of potatoes than you do out of grains. Toynbee also argued that new land was brought into cultivation. And so things that previously had either not been used because we couldn't, or was used for something else, now became available for agriculture. It is said that an English acre produced about 40% more than a French one. And a sign of this is that the English people are eating more white bread. It's kind of funny. Now we sort of see eating white bread as a sign of being poor. And back then it was a sign of being rich. You ate brown bread, whole wheal stuff. So you probably lived a lot better and healthier than you did if you weren't doing that. So land was one of those issues. And Toynbee pointed out that one of the other options was something called enclosure. Now, enclosure is this idea that some lands that used to be open and available for other people to use were now being closed off. And certainly richer people and I guess perhaps more abusive kinds of landlords and tenants would block land from various people so they couldn't use it. So you could take your cow out into the common and you could go out and maybe forage for things in certain parts of the woods. And then the richer sort started to hive off these areas of lands and stop people from going on and using them. And so people began to lose these rights. They lost them. And so in the 18th to 19th century, we have something called enclosure, which is parliamentary in nature. But people essentially left the areas to decide on their own. Sorry, the cat is attacking me here. Roxy. Okay, I'm going to pause this for a minute and I'll come back to you when I finish killing the cat. Right, hopefully there'll be fewer interruptions with him now. So what happens is that these enclosures, they enclose land that was previously open. So common land is appropriated. And this means that the average person who was in the agricultural sector would lose land that was previously available to him. But it meant that the people who owned this new enclosed land suddenly became rich. And of course, if you own 4/5 of the land around a village, you kind of get to decide what happens in that village. People would grab the title deeds. And this all is not good for the common man. And so Toynbee places all of these things, the Great Men option, the change in land, enclosure, and he puts all of this in between 1760 and 1840. And all this change is due to the Enclosure Acts. He talked about the selection of animal breeding. So yeah, with animal breeding, what we have is the option to prevent animals from breeding. We have controlled breeding. So rather than just letting your prize bull run around inseminating whoever he wants, you can control. So you can aim him at particular cows who you know to be producing good calves or good milk or whatever. And the same thing goes throughout the industry. If you go and look at some of the artwork from this time period, you'll see lots of somewhat distorted, I suppose, pictures of animals, big pigs, big cows, all very lovingly painted as a sort of a paean, I guess, to breeding and good breeding. It's kind of an interesting thing. You'll see them in little pubs and things every now and then. Anyway, so Toynbee all the way does this. Now, there are parts of this that may be slightly suspect, and there have been sort of two main criticisms of this. Firstly, that the great men weren't that great. Turnip Townsend, Lord Townshend, or Turnip Townsend, the guy who sort of put forward the idea that turnips are really that important. He was a boy when turnips were being grown on his estate, so he couldn't have put forward this idea about turnips because they were already there. Jethro Tull wasn't the first person to invent the seed drill. He may have perfected things. That's very often the case. Somebody who perfects something or does it, who makes a second iteration is often more famous than the person who comes up with the original idea. So that's the first problem. The great men are the great. Second is that the pace of change that's taking place. There are antecedents to this in the 17th century, so in the 1600s. So a lot of the stuff is actually taking place beforehand. And what exactly happens in this agricultural revolution rather depends on the historian. There are two related transformations in the agricultural economy. One is post 1700, where there's an increase in agricultural output, and that output is sustained. And that goes hand in hand with an increase in population, where each agricultural worker actually produced more. And the other issue is markets. In the 16th century, farmers put about 80% of their work to feed themselves. So if you're whatever you produce, 80% of it keeps you alive, and 20% you get to sort of fiddle around with. It's not a great ratio. If there is something goes wrong, if a harvest goes down, of course, something has to give. Either you can't sell things and get more money, or you don't eat. But by the 1850s, people are producing much more than they can need and that they can use. And so therefore they begin to sell it, and that increases and that produces markets. There's a whole sort of side of history that looks into markets and how they develop and what they produce and blah, blah, blah. So that's our first prerequisite to the Industrial Revolution, is that you need some sort of agricultural revolution to take place first. And we kind of have that. We have better agriculture, more is produced, more is available to be sold, and we are producing things much faster and better. At the risk of possibly repeating myself later on, just in something like the growth of yields, when you plant one seed in the ground, you get a certain return back, and it's a ratio. And back during the 1600s, it was like a 1-to-4 ratio. So if you put if you grow some grain, you'll get 4 bits of grain back from it on average. By the time, I forgot what the averages now are, but we're somewhere around like 1-to-70 or something ridiculous. And this ratio increases. And it begins to sort of pick up, and that's why the agricultural revolution begins to pick up so well and produces enough food for people to move into an industrial revolution. So that's the first thing. The first requisite is that we need an agricultural revolution. The second thing that we need is a transport system. And there are two really kinds of transport systems available in England. And England is pretty good, I guess, in that we're fairly compact. And we are fairly blessed with a number of things. So the first off is roads. Well, back then they're called turnpikes. Most of the inland industrial centres require these kinds of roads. So the places like Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield and Leeds, these are all major industrial areas. Most of the major roads are turnpiked by 1760. And what this means is that you have to sort of pay to use them, but it means that the roads are maintained and sort of kept up to date. So you've got a good, solid network going around the country via roads. And the second thing is rivers. Britain has a lot of navigable water. We have lots of coastal waters, so it's easy because we're an island, we can sail around it. We also have lots of rivers and canals built through it. And the canals tend to extend what is naturally there already. So we've already got a good system, and the canals just sort of expand it, sorry. And so we have a lot of investment in rivers and canals until about 1790. And these really expand in response to the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, we'll come along to things like trains, and trains will be important, but these are still prerequisites. So you've got to have a transport system to make the Industrial Revolution work. So that's transport, the second thing. The third thing that we need is a sophisticated money system. You need the availability of capital. And I already talked about how part of this capital comes from excess in produce. You produce more in your fields than you actually need to eat. So you can sell it, and you can do things with that money. And English landlords and the aristocracy were willing to get their hands dirty, unlike, for example, the French, who didn't do manual work at all and didn't want to have anything to do with it. Whereas English people were like, how can we make some more money out of this? And so that's what they did. They put their money that they gained back into their farms, back into their systems. They investigated new ways of doing things to increase the yields, to increase the money that they would get. And so we need capital. You have to have capital to invest in an industrial setting, and this has to come from somewhere. And surprisingly enough, a lot of this goes back to, at least a lot of the prerequisite for this goes back to the English Revolution, where somebody has to pay for this revolution. Somebody has to pay for the revolution. And so the British introduced things like excise tax, which is taxes on things that are consumed by consumption. So if you eat wine, sorry, if you drink wine or you eat pickles or something, you'd put a tax on it, and so that tax then goes back to something else. So there's an excise tax and there's a land tax. This paid for the Civil War, and was subsidized by William III. In other words, people have to, if you have land, you have to pay tax on it. Now, taxes that had been previously obnoxious to the moneyed interests had been abolished. Things like monopolies, impositions, arbitrary fines. Parliament now established taxes, and they tended to target the landed and the poorer classes, but it really wasn't enough. Where do you get money from? Well, the answer really came just after the English Revolution with the establishment of the Bank of England, which I think started in 1660, thereabouts. Banks were originally seen as quite suspicious. They were seen as a mark of republicanism. And one day I will look that up and tell you why. Sweden was the only monarchy to have a bank. Everybody else didn't have it unless if you were a republic. Now, there are three fundamental parts of a bank, or three functions, if you like. Firstly, you have to take deposits and put money in. Then you have to have discount bills, or essentially loans, and then issue notes, as in your own money. And what this all does is it concentrates and accumulates capital, which then allows it, somewhat paradoxically, to be spread around and used. So you have cheap, accessible credit, a flexible range of paper money, an easy transfer of cash internally and externally. And this is all done by about 1760, between 1660, the establishment of the bank, or at least the restoration, and 1760, which is kind of like the beginnings, depending on who you talk to, of the Industrial Revolution. So you've got to have money. You've got to have a sophisticated money system to be able to support everybody. And you also need an educational system. It's important that you have, well, to a degree, you need an educated elite at least. And you need a system that is geared towards commerce and industrial needs. And universities and schools did that admirably. They aimed this at the middle classes, and then the parish and charity schools aimed this at the artisan classes. So in other words, there are different segments of society that are targeted by different kinds of education. And the education is largely there to make you fit to work in whatever social milieu that you might find yourself in. So for example, most of you grew up going to school. Most of you had a bell that went off in a school. That goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, because the bell was the thing that told you when to stop and when to start work when you went to the factory. And so what they do is start you early in school with that kind of thinking. So you get used to the idea. So when you go to a factory, you're not surprised by what's this bell system and how does it work. So we've got an educational system that is primed and deliberately targeting people to work in particular areas. And that's kind of important because you need a well-trained workforce. Now, as I said, this helps you towards an industrial revolution, but it doesn't ensure that an industrial revolution. You need a couple of other things too, possibly. One is you need expansions in several sectors. You need industrial sectors need to be growing. You need to have a fairly decent chemical, not sure what to call it, segment of manufacturing or production, I guess, because you've got to produce things. You've got to be able to do things with chemicals, and you've got to be able to do that. And you need a fairly decent iron situation. You've got to have good iron, and you've got to make sure you can produce iron at sort of a good, decent level. The next thing that you actually need is, well, it's to do with geography. Often you would have areas of the country that were previously not used for very much, but suddenly with the increase in maybe techniques to discover things such as minerals. So for example, certain parts of the middle of England, not very good for very much, maybe growing sheep and not much ore. Suddenly you can now start mining. You can mine iron or coal, very important coal. And so sometimes you have to have expansion there's geographical expansion, and that creates new areas in England that are now suddenly populated with lots of people who are engaged in those particular industries that have suddenly come up because of this geographical expansion. But really, for growth to take place, I know I've talked about expansion in several places. You need a couple of things. The nature of business must become complex. So, for example, in the textile industry had to go, well, in the textile industry, once upon a time, you had to sort of go all over the place to get the whole process done from beginning to end. So, for example, you have sheep in a field and your end product is a shirt. There are lots of different elements in the process of getting that sheep to a shirt that have to take place. And that's called the cottage industry, or the putting out system. And these things are complex and need some sort of resolution. Iron manufacturing, for example, you have to tie iron to a fuel source, which mostly of the time is charcoal, and with water power, because we haven't really got coal, we haven't got steam engines yet. And so to increase your output, you have to spread things all the way around geographically. And that's not very efficient. You've got to then move things around the country, hopefully as fast as you possibly can. But you've also got these little parts of a system, little cogs in a wheel, that all have to sort of work together to produce something at the end. And it's just, you want to simplify that system as much as you possibly can. So we end up with some sort of pressure on technology. And technology is one of those big things about the Industrial Revolution that we talk about. Well, we'll talk about, maybe I'll talk about industry. I'll talk about technology a little bit later. So there's a generational thing that happens with this for growth. You have the first generation, which makes some sort of foundation, which the second generation then takes, builds on that, and it plows the money back into the industry, and you get an increase in capitalist response. And so each generation gets faster and faster in terms of growth and technological output. Now, I've said all these things, but it doesn't actually mean that you will automatically progress to a revolution. You'll have to need one more element, which I'll talk about just in a second, and that's got to do with growth and population. So when we come to England's position, England is in a prime position in the 18th century. It's not importing capital equipment or any capital on any great scale. It's all self-generated. But most of its leading sectors are export-oriented, such as textiles. We are exporting things around the world. Now, whether you think some of that is maybe to the disadvantage of certain indigenous people, that's absolutely probably true in places like India. But it's happening nonetheless, and this is what helps cause, or at least fuel, the Industrial Revolution. Now, when it comes to the Industrial Revolution itself, there are certain problems in that historians disagree with what caused it. This is the freeing up of capital through laissez-faire capitalism. Is it because we're moving away from mercantilism, the idea that there is a finite amount of wealth in the world, and therefore, if you want extra wealth, you've got to grab it yourself? So we're not sure what caused it. We are not sure on what it was, when it happened. A whole range of dates have been put. I've got here in my notes 1600 to the 19th century. I'm fairly certain I've seen people argue that the mills in the 12th century are sort of part of the Industrial Revolution, which I think is a bit silly, but you sort of get the idea that many things produce changes, and it's just a question of how far back do you want to go to sort of see how much there is a change. What does that change produce? And can you sort of say this is part of the Industrial Revolution? And what does it actually mean? This is why terms are actually kind of important. So we don't know what caused it, what it was, when it happened, and what it led to. These are all debated points. And again, these are all things that people could argue about for hours on end. And there are many books written on these things. And probably to your great delight, I won't ask you to read any. But what we do know is that none of these things that I've talked about could have happened without a growth in population. And what we have is a population explosion in the 19th century, which is quite fortuitous in terms of timing. The population doubled in the first half of the 19th century, and that is insane growth. That's amazing. Now, it's true that it's not only England that has a population explosion. There are other countries. I think North America, had a 4% growth rate, if I remember correctly. These things are quite drastic. And all over the world, there is a population explosion because, we're getting better at doing stuff. But there's an expansion of overseas markets. There's more demand for goods because England and the other countries, of course, the other mostly European countries, are expanding their territories. They are looking for places to offload goods. I don't think I ever talk about this in this class, but there's a whole section from Lenin who talks about this as one of the reasons for it's not capitalism. It's for I can't think of the word. Anyway, the idea where you go over and take other people's countries, colonialism. Sorry, colonialism. He says is part of part of the reason for this is that people produce too much, and so they want to dump stuff off on other people. So you go and take over other lands to sort of gain an audience to which you can sell stuff. Anyway, well, maybe I'll talk about him another time, but not now. So firstly, there's a demand for more goods, and expansion from Western Europe brings to the world, brings resources and capital to Europe. So people go out and they find stuff and they sort of bring it back and they set up systems to bring stuff back to Europe. And this leads to an expansion in terms of the merchant classes and entrepreneurs. And this happens particularly in England. England is the primary beneficiary of expanded overseas trade because it ended up being the leading, I guess, the leading European overseas power in the 18th century. And after a couple of fairly painful wars, notably with the French, this ended in English ascendancy. All the other powers in Europe declined, so to speak. And so Britain, or England, I guess, depending on how you want to call it, saw a growing of their agricultural and industrial prowess. And they did this overseas as well. And this, they took over, for example, colonies overseas. For example, Canada, owned largely by the French. The French lost this after the 7 Years' War in the mid 1700s. And so England takes over places that were previously owned by other people, and that just creates more wealth and more things. So we've got a growth of population, plus, I guess, in a way, technology. And we have cheap textiles. We have what we call the Iron Age, not the original sort of archaeological Iron Age, but the age of iron, things that are made out of iron rather than wood. We have the use of steam power, and we have large numbers of people in industrial sectors, and this is now the norm, not the exception. In other words, you're more likely to end up in some sort of in some sort of industrial area rather than an agricultural one. And you can kind of see this. M.W. Flynn has a book called The Origins of the Industrial Revolution. And if you will look at the patents, there are patents, obviously patents are put out on inventions. And if you start in about the 1760s, there's less than a dozen patents put out a year. By 1766 to 1783, about 30 a year. In the 1790s, 60 to 85 a year. 1824, 180 a year. 1825, 250 patents a year are being put out. So we have then, I don't want to call it a perfect storm, but there are a number of factors that all come together that make the agricultural, sorry, that stem from the agricultural revolution, which makes an industrial revolution possible. I'll talk about an industrial revolution in another lecture. But these are all the different areas that kind of prime England to be the premier place to have an industrial revolution, so to speak. Once Britain starts doing this, the other countries tend to follow suit, not necessarily at the same pace, but with a certain amount of jealousy, I think. And you can see this mostly with somebody like the Germans, who are very desperate to stay ahead of the British. And we will see some of the consequences of that when we get to the First World War. But at least for the moment, we have a number of things that all work in Britain's favor. Good population, a growing population, an interest from the agricultural classes in creating better agriculture and markets. These are all things that kind of help us to together, and chuck in a couple of things like well, technology mostly, and a monetary system. All of this allows you to have an industrial revolution. So later on, we'll talk about what an industrial revolution is and how it popped up. But at least this gives us the prerequisites for what's going on and what it actually results in.